Standard House rules apply. Speeches are 8 minutes. Reply speeches are 4 minutes. Kindly engage. It helps us break deadlocks, especially in clashes. And ultimately, at the end of the day, enjoy your round. Us prop, we're ready when you're here.
I'd just love to confirm audibility. Can I be heard?
Loud and clear.
Okay, my POI preference, I'll be taking POIs in my 4th minute. So you can unmute and you ask your POI. I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. So, Chair, we think at a point where indigenous communities in the countries that have been sort of outlined in status quo, like for far too long, have been disenfranchised. We think that this kind of disenfranchisement is something that is very detrimental, something that we should stop. And we think at that point in time, we go ahead to inherently propose this particular motion. Today, we are not only going to argue why the matter of moral obligation is like sort of like very important, but also question things like legal responsibility, even in the vast majority of instances. The reparations are not only like some sort of necessary step towards things like reconciliation, but also we think it is like something important, something that is crucial, and something that is crucial, or like some sort of crucial investment in the future of the people inherently, right? So firstly, a couple of things that you're going to get from my speech, but firstly, on setup, a few mechanisms in which we think this debate should inherently run. Firstly, I'm going to show you and analyze the kind of nature of what these particular indigenous populations look like, but even I'm going to show you what these reparations in and themselves already are. Firstly, on indigenous populations and what they inherently look like or what they are characterized by particularly. Firstly, we think this kind of populations, first of all, like have some sort of a historical continuity with the kind of pre-colonial existence that was inherently there, right? We think they've sort of like developed on things like their territories, even in the first place. They are characterized by majorly two things. We look at ancestral territories, ones that already existed even before they inherently existed, right? But two, we think this kind of communities are like sort of marginalized and we think they've been excluded from the mainstream, right? We think these communities have like a unique set of rights and interests that must sort of be recognized and respected by the government, even in the first place. That becomes like very important. These communities look like the Native Americans when you look at countries like USA. We also consider things like First Nations in countries like Canada. We think this is like sort of like very important, even in the first place. What do these reparations look like, and why do they like inherently even exist in the first place, right? We think this kind of reparations go ahead to look like at things like our culture preservation, right? We think at a point where this particular kind of communities should sort of like be hope to go ahead and preserve things like their traditions and cultures even in the first place. It becomes like sort of very important at a point where you notice that culture preservation helps a culture like sort of go ahead like to continue. We think continuity even exists even in the first place, right? But even number two, we think this kind of reparations are then inherently characterized by things like economic compensation, right? We think this particular kind of communities should get like some sort of financial compensation for the historical injustices they inherently like sort of face, right? Such as things like forced relocation, things like cultural suppression, even in the first place. That becomes very important to consider this kind of reparation. Inherently, they exist in the first place because of the kind of historical background that they inherently already existed, even in the countries that were outlined the outline in the info slide, even in the first place, right? So I'm going to like give you some sort of framework and paradigm in which we think this debate should inherently run as proposition side. Firstly, we think that the kind of international law that already exists with a body that is a United Nations declaration on the rights of these indigenous peoples. We think this is the kind of sort of body that goes ahead to recognize this particular kind of people's rights, right? We think at a point where that particular kind of body inherently exists, it becomes like sort of important to make like this particular idea go ahead to like sort of work out even in the first place. We think that reparation is like sort of very important for the kind of injustices that were faced by this particular kind of communities even in the first place. So one, with that said, let's start with let me begin on my argumentation. Firstly, I'm going to start with the principle of responsibility and show you why we think that this is like sort of justified even in this particular debate, right? So we think that these particular countries with these large indigenous populations at a point where, like I showed you, they have some sort of history of things like colonialism, things like forced relocation, things like genocides that happened that were inherently against this particular kind of communities or against this particular kind of indigenous people, right? We think that particular community, that particular history in and of itself already gives the government like some sort of moral responsibility and moral right to go ahead and moral obligation to go ahead and provide this particular kind of reparations to these indigenous people, right? Firstly, I'm going to show you why it's true, but even two, I'm going to show you like why it sort of becomes like very important. Firstly, on why it's like sort of very true. One, we think at a point where this particular kind of communities have like sort of been disenfranchised for far too long, it becomes like sort of very important for governments to take up this particular kind of responsibility and give upon those particular kind of reparation. This is important. One, because we think we care like so much about these people, and at that point in time where we respect like sort of their rights and where we sort of like respect their rights, we think it still becomes important because when one's rights are respected, we think people are bound to like sort of feel like very okay and very good because they'll feel like sort of like they're catered for and even deserved, like even in the first place, the vast majority of instances, right? We think the principle of responsibility the principle of responsibility can still be grounded in principles of justice, even in the first place, right? So at a point where like justice sort of like achieved on our side of the debate, we think like it becomes like very important, right? We still with this particular kind of responsibility. I'm going to show you why at a point in time we are much more likely sort of going to get like more pragmatics on our side than what their side inherently already may get or may look like even in the first place, right? At a point where we have the principle of more responsibility like sort of existing on our side, we are much more likely able to get things like social justice for this particular kind of marginalized communities, right? So we think at a point in time where the disenfranchisement like has become like sort of like very much the frustration goes ahead to arise, right? So we think at that point in time what this particular kind of reparation, like I already showed you what they look like. If this particular kind of reparation are given to these communities, they are bound to first of all feel like some sort of social justice that is already existing. But even number two, we think things like their rights are inherently like sort of considered own, right? So I'm going to take you like on some sort of comparative on why like we're inherently able to this particular kind of analysis, right? So notice that from our side, at a point we're able like to sort of give that particular kind of reparation on the principle of responsibility. It's much more achievable on our side because one, we think at a point where these governments like it's some sort of legal morality, something that cannot be taken because some sort of moral obligation that cannot inherently like sort of like just be taken away, right? So we think on our side, at a point we're able to receive that kind of principle of responsibility, we think it becomes like important. What that side now looks like is that firstly, they argue this kind of disenfranchisement. They do not want it to stop, and that's why they inherently don't want this particular kind of reparations to like sort of go ahead and be taken even in the first place. We think that becomes detrimental. That is like sort of very selfish for them, even in the first place, right? So we think at a point in time where we inherently like sort of consider these people and sort of like feel so bad for this kind of disenfranchisement that has sort of like gone ahead to happen like for far too long, and at a point in time where these reparations become like a much more viable idea, a much more viable solution, we think it becomes like very important that we adopt it because it goes ahead to challenge even the existing status quo, and we think that is like sort of very important. So when governments take upon this particular kind of responsibility, they're able to sort of like all those sorts of claims and they're able to help out these disenfranchised people, and we think that becomes important because one, they are catered for, but even two, at a point where inclusivity already exists on our side, we think we still have that particular kind of we still achieve that particular kind of moral obligation and that particular kind of principle of responsibility on our side, and we think that becomes important for this particular round. With that, I'll have to rest.
The House wishes to thank and excuse first Affirmative for that submission, calling on fast opposition. Ready when you are. Here.
Okay, panel, am I audible?
Loud and clear.
Okay, so let me set my timer. Okay, so I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. The notion of providing reparations to indigenous communities is intuitively appealing. Rather, provision of reparations is not only impractical, but also potentially counterproductive, creating a risk of unintended consequences and dependency on government support. We cannot conform to such a cruel reality. We couldn't be more proud to oppose that governments should be morally and legally obligated to repart their differentialized and indigenous communities in the vast majority of cases. That is something we're proud to oppose. Key things then from my speech: a bit of setup, and then also a bit of engagement from propositions case, and show you like two clear arguments on why the complexity of this implementation is something we should actually consider, but then to the high, financial constraints that we already burden governments to inherently take. So first thing in terms of like setup, understand that we already do have a concession. We cannot say that, oh, these individuals have necessarily not been disenfranchised or probably not been marginalized, right? These are people that probably already exist, the original inhabitants, and we do concede that these people probably have been disenfranchised. But you having governments to morally and legally obligate them is something we cannot consider in the vast majority of cases. Thing in terms of how these large indigenous populations are. Proposition tries to run a smart case of, oh, they're only marginalized, but also their ancestral territories are inherently taken, and their no rights are and their rights are necessarily not catered for. I will engage that within my speech. But then first panel, that these indigenous groups in and itself, like by the motion has told you that they're large. It means that there are very many in numbers. But then secondly, the terms of reparations inherently vary as in terms of like what injustices necessarily happen. Blaming the governments to actually go ahead and probably give you these reparations is something of like something very heavy for governments to necessarily take. But then thirdly, panel, consider that injustices inherently differ in the vast majority of cases, right? So at a point in time, if we already heavily burden government, it is something we cannot conform because government in and itself already has its responsibilities. What does proposition tell us to do? Like, what does proposition tell us in the vast majority of cases? First, it tells us, oh, we think that indigenous populations are marginalized and their rights are not catered for. Key responses to this: A, we think that the governments in and itself have already done their best within status quo to actually promote their heritages in terms of them setting up heritage museums and probably having cultural preservation, cultural preservation museums for these individuals. But then secondly, we see that these things have necessarily been included within school curriculums. For example, in the United States, where the Red Indians are inherently taught about to students in the vast majority of cases. So it means that the individuals within society do already know these people, do already know what like problems they necessarily had, and probably do know about their histories. So at a point in time, you cannot say that these people are inherently marginalized and oppressed, or their rights are not necessarily catered for. But then secondly, they come and talk about the idea of principle of responsibility and etc. I think that is already achieved within status quo at a point in time when governments in and itself have done this like key things. They've been able to cater for these indigenous groups by putting them within, like by engaging them within their political discussions and political forums. We see countries like New Zealand and the US have already set seats within their congresses to actually have their seats for these indigenous people in the vast majority of cases. We see that these people already have voices that they are able to actually, address in the vast majority of cases. But then secondly, we see that for the idea of principle of responsibility, like more already achieved because they already have indigenous day celebrations at a point in time when, if this was necessarily non-existent, maybe would actually then have the government's morally and legally obligated. But at a point in time when the government inherently has taken up the responsibility already to already put them in power, to already put them and engage them in discussions, to already save we have a specific day for these people to actually be recognized and celebrated. That is something we think should actually be upheld within society. Morally obligating and legally obligating governments is inherently very detrimental in the vast majority of cases. You cannot blame government and probably bound them to actually do all these reparations in the vast majority of cases. From our side of the house, then as team opposition, we think there's a high complexity of implementation. That is why we tell you it is not only impractical but potentially counterproductive, because there are unintended risks that inherently come with this. Three things, panel here. A, we think that you cannot necessarily address each and everything, right? Determining the eligibility of this criteria is quite contentious. It inherently means that at a point in time, if you have a red Indian or you have a Sudahari and a Kwantari that have various, ideologies and probably have various injustices and necessarily are there, we think that it's very complex and probably contentious for governments to necessarily address each and everything in the vast majority of cases. But then secondly, understand this is that how much have they necessarily been disenfranchised in the vast majority of cases? We see that over the decades, we have seen that these people inherently have done crossbreeding with a vast populations within the society. We think at a point in time, if there is a very hard ability for you to actually necessarily determine the eligibility of individuals who have been necessarily disenfranchised, it's something that is very difficult for government to necessarily do. That is why we think that is something we cannot aside with within the debate, within the debate. But then thirdly, we think it's not morally right to blame the government, because proposition already tells you this is something that happened during colonial times. I mean, we'd have blamed colonial masters, but at the end of the day, hey, they already got independence. So for you to actually have this moral and legal obligation onto the government, and having the extent of government responsibility for past injustices is something not good to necessarily credit within this debate, and it's something we necessarily think should actually be done within this. That's why from our side of the house, we tell you that governments in and itself have already done, the crucial things of them to actually uphold. We tell you that, hey, we consider these people have been disenfranchised, but we see in status quo that these things have been done within the various cases. We tell you, oh, hey, they've already got political forums, they've been able to address their rights. So when proposition says, oh, their rights are not catered for, or they are probably oppressed, that is inherently flawed and probably not right within their case. But secondly, we tell you how their cultures and heritage have inherently been preserved. We tell you how governments have inherently added their culture, their ancestral information within the school curricula. So it means as generations inherently grow, this culture inherently continues with the vast majority of cases. So making government bound and blaming it to the extent of it actually reparating it is something we cannot take within the debate. But then secondly, panel, in terms of the heavy burden on government in terms of financial constraints, we tell you that proposition says, oh, hey, at a point in time, these people necessarily have to be reparated, they should be given money and all that. Panel, understand that the government is supposed to cater for each and every individual within society in terms of catering its services, healthcare for each and everyone. For each and everyone also includes these ingenious people. At a point in time when you have such a notion that they should be morally and legally obligated, it inherently shifts priorities, which is something we necessarily don't want within the status quo. But first, we tell you that it's going to necessarily create a heavy dependence on government, because at a point in time when these individuals necessarily rely on government's reparations, we think there's not going to be self-determination, as they cannot necessarily work and support themselves. And that is not a system we necessarily deserve, we necessarily want within the current status quo, in a world where there's continuous evolution and probably technologies that inherently are working. We want a system where government inherently does their best to actually make sure that each and everyone is respected. It already does a system where these ingenious communities are inherently upheld and already have their voices. So at a point in time when proposition comes and tells us, oh, hey, they are oppressed and probably don't have any room, we don't think that's right, panel. Opposition wins the debate. Proud to oppose.
House wishes to thank and excuse first opposition speaker, calling on second affirmative. Ready when you're here.
Okay, give me a set up my timer. And my speech will begin in 3, 2, 1. In the year 1894, we have Frank Reinhardt, who is most famously known for taking his many pictures of Native American participants, right? Usually giving the colonialists an idea of what these people look like, what they are going through, right? But Pana, you come to realize within time that these pictures was more seen now as what are stereotypical, but this is particularly what the generalized belief in society of what these groups actually looks like, right? Pana, you move later into the 20th century, you're seeing this particularly done by another photographer going by the names of Gertrude Kaseba, right? Now, Pana, and then when you also look now into the 21st century, right, you come with the New York Times giving you an entire article of showing you of how these particular heritage parks are generally not giving these workers the best conditions, right? Majority of these workers even reported being forced to just dress up like this and going against their cultures for the most stereotypical view, just in order to get money for a living, right? So particularly, Pana, when you clearly see how these groups function within society. Like you generally see what side opposition gives is more just like a generalized clue of government just doing the bare minimum and trying to pat itself in the back, right? So particularly panel. In today's debate, what side opposition is trying to do is just it's giving you the minimum and it's just trying to say what, okay, well, we have done our best, right? But what side proposition is trying to tell you is that what, particularly these groups have gone through injustice and actually do deserve to get what this particular what franchises. Now, panel, my speech is now going to go into rebuttal or showing you particularly why their particular trying to show of our case going to lead to dependency is not going to work. And particularly showing you how this is not going to strain the government, but is actually better off for the government. And particularly number three, we're going to show you why these reparations are actually much needed and why the government is obligated to give it to these people morally and legally, right? Now, panel, into first rebuttal, what creating like a dependency into these people when you reparate them by giving them money and so on, right? Particularly panel, I give you in my opening minutes that okay, these people are like so down bad, like it's that bad, right? The educational system is more of just giving you like a stereotypical view, right? But these people are like so down bad they can't actually come to defend for it, right? But particularly panel, our side of reparations believe that particularly if you were to give these particular groups this money, right? You have to give them this land. What are you going to do? You're now actually going to give these people like an opportunity to get into education, right? Because as of now, they don't have the money, they don't have the resources to get into education. So these people can particularly help themselves. But by giving them these reparations, these people can actually get the education, they can actually now develop themselves, they can actually now be put into other sectors, which actually means now these people in the long run are not really going to need this much dependency at all, but rather are going to become what more of less marginalized people, but more of like at an equal footing with other people in society, leading them to actually be more helpful into the government. So in the long run, you come to realize this is going to what spend less money onto them. Now onto second. And now into the secondary battle, right? These particular individuals of what this particular thing going to be like so strenuous for the government, right? Particularly panel, as side opposition, side proposition also does believe if government has what has a responsibility over all the people in its country, right? And we believe that particularly that particular case we give is the best case scenario we give to these people, rather than the bare minimum, which you can see within status quo is not failing to give these people the justice which they need. So we believe in our side, we are doing better for these individuals as the government because we are allowing them to be like more better people in society, actually contribute more and stop, already spending a lot of money into like heritage museums and so on. Because we believe outside affirmative, just like major groups within society, we believe that if these people can actually be better off, particularly they can actually now give like more accurate things about who they are and so on, right? Now, number two, that particular strain on government idea which these people talk about, right? We feel that's not really going to stand a lot in today's debate for one multiple reason, right? Like we are seeing governments throwing away billions of dollars just to build highways and so ever. We have seen governments like the USA literally put billions in projects such as NASA and just, okay, while it didn't work, we can just walk away, right? These are the countries we are talking about and like which have like very huge budgets, right? So particularly giving the money to actually what you reparate these people and actually put them back into society, we really don't feel it's going to be much of a strain onto the government, right? And particularly, we also come and give you like in my opening speech again, how this is actually going to turn out and be like a better investment for the government in the long run, right? Now, panel number two. Now, number two, which we now also now want to talk about now into our cases, what these people have gone through and now why government should now also be obligated to actually give these people this particular thing, right? Number one, you need to understand, right? These people have lost their land, right? Like, let's first break down this debate. Imagine you have something which belongs to you. Then someone comes and takes it from you, right? And on top of taking it from you, they take away your dignity as a human being, right? But what they'd rather do, they don't admit it, but rather they try to paint a facade that, okay, you're still a human being, but in the reality, you're not. You're going through like the bare minimum of what it is being a human being, right? Now imagine that. Now imagine I now come and tell you, you know what? We're not going to give you your thing back, right? Because it's going to be like so impractical and it's really going to strain us, right? But you can clearly see that it was taken away from you. So we believe that on one aspect that these people do actually deserve to have this historical wrong be written away from them, right? That's a major point on our particular side, right? And now that is something which side opposition is not going to give for because they try to say that's being done in their world and so on. But like we already paint you how in status quo, it's like the bare minimum and it's not really helping as much as they're trying to put it on, right? Then particularly panel number 2 our case, right? And the number 2 on our case, I'm going to say it is that
Speaker, you're
what
breaking.
this also
Speaker, you're breaking.
wait, am I clear
Speaker,
again?
you have
Sorry,
you
am
have
I
1
stable
minute and
again?
58 seconds to go.
Okay, the
So
number 2, right? This actually makes these people actually what be much better with the government has acknowledged the wrongs which did to them. So we believe this now puts these people be like in a much better place with their government. And I feel as a government, one of your main incentives is you want everyone who is actually under your control to actually be happy with how you're governing people and so on, right? Because now this like creates like easier relationships between you and people, making it like much easier for you to actually bring out policies and have like discussion and so on, right? So particularly panel, in summary, what we try to give you in our case is that what side opposition talks about this marginalized people is more like stereotypical and not actually what's going down in the ground. Because like when you take time to dissect what's going to happen, these people are really like in a bad state, right? Then particularly number 2, we come and give you like the entire case of impracticality shouldn't like carry a lot of weight, because now you see if you're now to give these people like these reparations, it's going to create dependency, but it's not going to give them like enough resource to actually put themselves back into what's limelight to actually start living as people. And we feel that's going to be like better for the government. The number 2, we also come to look at it in an angle that what you now have these people acknowledging the past wrong, so which means they can actually now work better with the government and look at it better. And I feel for any government that's something which would actually want in order to govern. So, and with that, I believe what side opposition tries to push towards what is very incorrect within how the world is moving, and this ballot should actually go to to the bench on proposition.
the House wishes to thank and excuse second affirmative for submission. Calling on second op. We're ready when you are. Here.
Okay, panel, could you just confirm if you can hear me?
Loud and clear.
Okay. Okay, yeah. I'll take my POIs after my rebuttal, just before my extension. I'll call for the POI, so yeah, kindly don't budge up. I'll begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, a while back, the Kenyan government constantly burdened like the UK about things like more reparation towards colonial crimes. What happens with the Kenyan government right now? Right now, the economy is deteriorating. They have bad relations with like the UK, and generally things aren't getting better. We think that's the world that Prop has to defend. I think generally the first thing I want to highlight is that, look, this debate can't exist in a world where the both sides are arguing for the same world. I think there needs to be a distinction between the status quo which Prop has to defend and is defending, and the world which proposition has to defend. The impact there, or what I'm trying to say here, is that proposition has a burden within this debate to prove their radical measures, such as redistribution of land and large costs to compensate like their genocide and all those things. They can't claim small impacts, because even in that case, they don't win the debate. They can't exclusively claim their impacts. I want to work with the first speeches and a few clashes, and then I move on to the material that was brought by second prop. I think there are a few charts in the first speeches. I think the first is a characterization of like what exactly this disenfranchisement means and like what it looks like with today's government. I think firstly, the push from the first prop is dangerous for their case, because the justification they give is things like genocides and wars and forced relocations that happened in colonial era. I think one, they don't give us any logical connection towards the government of today. I don't think they can prove that justification, which means the connection to that the governments of today are logically responsible for those types of things. I think the mere fact they give like their examples as colonial eras, they can't link it to today's government. Their moral justification doesn't stand. I think the impact there is that majority of their claims are nullified. Panel, they can't take that clash. I think the second clash here is on the whole idea of like what reparations look like and like the quantification. I do think within the specific debate, government has a burden to show us what exactly these things are going to look like, and to show us that their impacts are going to happen like in that manner that they likely prove that like they likely assert they're going to happen in. I think the impact there is the first thing. I think the distinction between status quo and things like the world which they are proposing means that they can't opt for things like cultural preservation. I think Samrawit gives you a good analysis as to why those things are largely existed within the status quo. I think that analysis is out. I think the last remaining remaining thing, which means in terms of reparations that government gives us, is in terms of things like economic like compensation, like money and land. I think this is a chat about like financial, like the financial government's ability and why it's detrimental for their side of the house. I think Samrawit gives you a good argument, and she tells you that, look, governments have an obligation to provide to a large number of individuals. And notice, panel, this is a contesting principle which contests to like their idea of like responsibility. I think on weighing, our principle is more important because status quo already covers for those like marginalized individuals within like status quo. I think Samrawit comes and tells you that the government obligation to like the state as a whole already encompasses those individuals, which means on weighing, that principle is more important. But even secondly, in terms of like whether that principle will be fulfilled, I think the attack in terms of like government's ability to compensate all these individuals speaks to the fact that their principle can't be achieved. They don't give us any analysis as to why, one, when individuals get money, they're able to like get all their lives back, which were committed in terms of like genocide, or like get all their land back. I don't think that analysis is there. I think they are lacking. I think it speaks to the idea that, one, their principle of like responsibility can't be actualized. I think the second chart here is in terms of things like government like ability to compensate individuals and why it's a slippery slope. I think the chart here is that the push from government is that, look, government already has the ability to like to spend on these things. They have like they're spending billions of money on like so many things. They have the ability. I don't think that's true. I think the response to Samrawit is that, look, government has so many programs which it's running. I think even the US itself like has a lot of debt. I don't think you can prove that it's a very strong economy. US has debt, but even secondly, I think it's a slippery slope, and this is something that Samrawit tells you, because Samrawit comes and tells you that, look, the context within these marginalized individuals is that status quo has changed. They have intermarried with so many individuals. The crimes that were committed were things that are past. The crimes were committed were past crimes. They were so heavy, they can't be quantified. Things like lies, genocide. I don't think they give us a metric as to how those things are going to like actively be like quantified in terms of like costs. I think the impact of there is, one, it's a slippery slope because government then has to be continuously reparating these individuals. This looks like why Kenya is constantly asking the UK for reparations. I think secondly, the amount of reparations is then going to be like unquantified and big, which means government strain is still existent within this debate. I think they had to prove that, not to say it's a policy debate, but the aspect at which they're proposing for their impacts, they have to show us why these things are likely to happen within that manner. I think the last chart here is like why exactly status quo mechanisms are enough and like why it's a bad chart for them. I think Samrawit comes and gives you a good context. I think they come and paint a bad picture about status quo, and like notice this extends into like the second speaker's speech on terms of like why these heritage sites are like bad and those things. I think the chart here is that the push from government is that these mechanisms are not enough and these people are so bad they're disenfranchised. I don't think that characterization is true. I think the characterization of status quo looks like we have women getting into power, we have minority groups in terms of like tribal groups getting into power and representing their ideas. Status quo looks like equality then being fostered within status quo. I don't think that they can prove that they're disincentivized. I think that they have to provide a world where they have to provide radical change for those individuals, which looks like land distribution, and why these things are so bad is what Samrawit's argumentation then tells you within her speech. I think the impacts of both worlds are this. Our side, status quo looks like individuals then fostering equality generally because they are more integrating with others. There's no forced mechanism, there's no forced relocation of land. Individuals are able to accept each other. Status quo that's already happening. We have so many things where marginalized groups are being put into power. We have black presidents, we have female presidents coming in, like contesting for presidency. We have minority groups standing up. I think status quo looks like our side getting better, like incorporation of these individuals. I think the impacts from props world looks like, one, government straining, but even secondly, they don't give any justification, and like this is on the moral part, they don't give any justification why those status quo governments are in charge for like those genocides, which means they can't prove any obligation. They just have government retaliation because individuals are being accused of past crimes which they didn't commit. I think on those metrics, the prop case is out. I think the extension which I want to run, but before I check the extension, any POI 3, 2, 1. Okay, I think the extension which I want to run in my speech is why exactly this thing worsens like societal divisions. I think the chart here and the claim within this extension is that when you then go and give radical measures such as land distribution or like significant financial compensation, it means that you then worsen the division between individuals because of that unfair obligation. And I think this partly like affects part of the chart of like the contesting principle from Samrawit about like government's obligations, like a large number of individuals, but it's more about like generally individuals at the grassroots because they are then seeing it as unfair because individuals are giving a large radical change for a sake of compensation, which the governments of that didn't affect. I think this is worse because, one, economies are then made to struggle. I think this chart looks like individuals being put in harsh lifestyles because because the government is made to pay compensation for other past crimes. I think, but even secondly, I think the radical like the increment or the double work that these governments are then being forced to do because status quo mechanisms are being painted as not enough. I think the impact of there is that, one, it takes out their entire their entire claim on like how these individuals are going to be able to like get accepted or become like empowered, because in that case scenario, what actually happens when you do this means that you actually have like people like a bad perception of unfairness being painted onto these individuals, which means things like worsening are more likely on their side of the house. I think the truth underlying things like why exactly marginalization happens is because of a bad image or like bad reputation, like individuals don't like each other. I think the reason as to why that is much worsened on their side of the house is because when you then divide people further, it means that on your side of the house you have individuals hating on those individuals, which means the ability of them to interact with government and integrate properly is worse. I think the biggest problem here in the debate is that Prop has a burden to defend a world where the status quo is then not enough, and they have to provide like radical mechanisms. I think they run a soft line analysis and try to like give small impacts. They don't want to touch on like majority of their things like land relocation, which they try to hint like financial compensation. I think the disadvantage with that is that you get much more anger from people, you get government strain. The impacts here is that one, that marginalized individuals don't become better on your side. I think our side, the status quo is better because you have individuals generally being respected and integrating within society. Status quo has proven that we have changed. Reparations can't help you. We're so proud to oppose.
House wishes to thank and excuse second opposition speaker for fine submission. Polygon third prop ready when you're here.
Let me first set my time.
All right.
Okay. I'm going to begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, notice that this debate is very, very heavy on the principle. We think that what we get as like an opposing principle from opposition is something about the responsibility of government to several people. I'm going to show you within my speech why that principle cannot stand. But notice, panel, that an important thing to note is that the reason why majority of these wealthy countries are wealthy, the countries stated within the info slide, is that they utilize the resources from the land that they got from these indigenous individuals. We think that alone closely ties them to the current governments, because even the prosperity within the current government still depends on that particular resource. But even secondly, when they argue around the idea that there's that tourism idea, we think it's still a bit of exploitation, because majority of like tourists flocking within these countries are going there to view these things. Notice that countries like New Zealand, majority of their tourists come to see where the Aboriginals lived. We think there's still some sort of economic benefit that the current government is getting from these individuals. That alone shows you that on principle, there needs to be some sort of economic prioritization of these individuals, which we think reparations then look like. Firstly, on some rebuttal, we get this entire idea from opposition about how they're having steps being moved forward for these particular individuals. Panel, we think this is actually like very absurd, because when they talk about things like representation, we think this is actually helping only the wealthier indigenous individuals. Notice that in countries like the United States, 73% of the indigenous population are not even registered voters. That means the seats that they have within their Congress for indigenous people are being like voted by only the non-disenfranchised indigenous people. I feel like the debate was mostly supposed to be about the disenfranchised indigenous people. We think on strategy, that was actually like an issue from their side. But even secondly, but we think that all these like things that they talk about, all these benefits they talk about, can be better achieved after these particular communities have been equipped and majority of them have been pushed out of that particular like sort of suffering that they're going through today. Now, the idea of crossbreeding and the fact that some of them are coming up, we think that's not where the debate happens. The debate happens within the communities that are still struggling. Understand that the crossbreeding nationals they talk about are actually not that common. Within countries like Australia, 90% of the Aboriginals are not having any other change of blood except to the primitive people that are coming from the higher areas of Indonesia. We think that is not good crossbreeding, and that crossbreeding is not where the debate is happening. Those that have developed on their own right are not where the debate is happening. The disenfranchised groups are the most important thing within this debate. Now, the idea that you teach about these individuals, we think that is not what these stakeholders need. The stakeholders need is not to be taught about within school. What they need is to get out of the conditions that they are struggling with. We think even if you said that what they wanted was to be taught in school, the narrative is still against them, right? Things like movies and like shows are still portraying these individuals as extremely primitive, living within caves. We think even if they wanted to be known and that is all they needed, they didn't want to be known in that particular way. And we think that is wrong. Now, a strategic mistake we get from proposition is when they assume that reparation is tied to cash handouts. We think that's not what it is. Firstly, we think reparation looks like economic prioritization. That means you prioritize economically uplifting these communities. That means supporting their businesses in that regard with some state funding. That means equipping them with skills and being very intentional with whom you equip. And it can look like cash handouts where it's necessary, but it is not tied to cash handouts. We think on that, they don't win. Now, let me first address what we get from second op. They tell us that government is going to, like, there's going to be more division within these individuals. We think that's something that's actually symmetrical, right? Notice these individuals are aware of how their land was taken from them. It's been hundreds of years, but it's something that still goes through their tradition. They are aware of what happened within the past. We think already within status quo, these individuals are already not like friendly, or already don't like the other rest of their civilization. So we think that actually, if this civilization shows some sort of like way they are going to help these individuals, that disunity that already exists will be the one that disappears. We think that that disunity does not exist on our side, but it exists more on their side as it is in current status quo. That's why we see like a lot of violence from these particular communities to these individuals. Now, on to the clashes within the debate. I felt like there were two clashes within the debate. The first was on government finance. They tell us that government cannot actually like be able to fulfill these things because it has too many obligations. And notice, this is the principle that we get from opposition bench. Now, how this then becomes like, our response to that was that very few like, was that in the first place, these are governments that basically like have a lot of resources. The governments mentioned within the info slide are governments like the United States. The United States is a country that has majority of its budget going to things like space exploration. Majority of its budget going to things like military. Notice that the US budget for military is $800 billion. $500 billion away from that of like the second nearest military spending country. What does that mean? These countries are countries that spend too much money, and that means that all they need is some sort of redirection. We think redirection of these funds is very much possible. 4 reasons why we win this clash. The first is we think that inherently, if they claim that the government has a reason to like fight against, if they claim that the government has like a responsibility, we think it has a responsibility then to these individuals, a moral obligation to these individuals. Why? Because they're inherently citizens of the country. Majority of these countries don't even have that many poor people, right? Majority of the poor people within these countries are these indigenous individuals. We think at that point in time, it even lands into the government's responsibility inherently to provide reparations to these people. Secondly, we think that these countries are actually countries that have a lot of resources. It is very much possible to redirect if they just sort of like prioritize. That's what the entire debate is about. If they prioritize, they are very much capable of redirecting and being able to afford this particular thing. Thirdly, we think even then, they cannot outweigh the principle, right? Something was done, someone was wrong, and the right has to be done. We think on principle, they still can't justify it by clearly just saying that it's strange. And then finally, we think that these populations are not that many and their needs are not that many. What they need is to just meet the bare minimum for survival, which they cannot meet at the moment. We think the United States government is very much possible to do this without even feeling any strain, right? We think at that point in time, these governments are much likely to still be able to run while still being able to provide these individuals with the bare minimum for survival. The second clash here is on dependence, right? They tell us that the government is going to like make these individuals dependent on them by particularly, the government is going to make them dependent by continuously giving them money. And then we tell you that they will not become dependent. We think we win this thing because reparation is not tied to money. I already explained that to you. It's not necessarily just a cash handout. It's an economic uplifting that is intentional to these particular communities. We think then 2 things here. Firstly, we think it is very much likely that these individuals are going to be able to develop from this particular thing, and after some point, they'll not even need any sort of reparation, right? We think government then can sort of like let go of these individuals after they stop being disenfranchised. But even secondly, we think that if these particular individuals, if this particular government puts in some sort of economic like prioritization, these individuals can be uplifted to a point that they can actually support the economy themselves. Their participation in the economy itself can actually help the government in general to like better itself in this particular regard. Now, Pana, I think we need to like look into the problem within this debate. The problem generally is that there are disenfranchised people who are indigenous within society. What do we do to solve this problem? We tell you we are promoting reparation in form of economic prioritization. What do they do is assume that teaching about them in school and all these things that do not help. We think on the comparative, they cannot win this debate. Thank you.
I also choose to thank and excuse that prompt for that submission. Calling on third opposition speaker to close off the substantive for the House. Here.
Am I audible enough?
Loud and clear.
All right. Let me pass it my timer. Right. Okay. Okay. So I begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, first notice on the contradictions that we get from third speaker's speech, right? Firstly, he tells us that on their side, right, reparations look like, all right, economic uplifting and economic compensation. We get that. We buy into that whole idea. But then their first speaker also comes and tells us that, you know what, reparation also looks like things like cultural preservation and economic compensation. And yet third speaker is continually disregarding the efforts of the governments that are currently in status quo from like how they have been culturally preserving these particular indigenous communities. Firstly, on the whole idea, right, of how like reparation does still happen without them being morally or legally obligated to. Firstly, on the whole idea that, you know, they claim that, you know what, government does not cater for these indigenous people and they don't matter at all. Firstly, they have seats on Congress in all the countries that they are noticing countries like New Zealand and stuff like that. To rebut this, they come and through like a very bogus, a very wrong, a statistic that, you know what, 73% of Native Americans are non-registered voters. But I don't think you can buy into this statistic, first of all, because it is false, because necessarily what you see is that 97% of the red Indians that are currently in status quo actually registered. Then they're going to tell us how you know what, like we don't care for their culture. But no, their history is put in the education curricula. But no, there are schools, as my second speaker and first speaker told you, that are necessarily there to teach indigenous people their indigenous cultures. They have special celebration days for the indigenous day celebrations. They preserve their cultural heritage in museums. So technically, we do the reparations currently in status quo without the government being morally or legally obligated to do so. Two, firstly, on the whole idea, this debate is on the obligation that exists, right? Because the obligation that the government has that exists currently, because status quo already benefits the individuals who are disenfranchised. Through things we have showed you, putting their curricula in school, through things like giving them seats in Senate that advocate for their particular people and something like that, even giving them things like economic enfranchisement and stuff like that, right? We see that whatever they are planning to do, is still being done on our side, and even in a much better and more safer way. Secondly, on the whole idea that, you know what, majority of US's budget is like spent on space exploration and military and whatsoever. So, three battles to this. Firstly, on the whole idea, right, of like USA being like the most indebted country in the world. That's number one. Number two, being a country and a world superpower that needs to protect its interests. Like, how can its interests through things like military, right? They have to put more money into the military so they can safeguard the people of the United States. But even if that is not so, USA is having like a trade deficit. That's why Trump wants a lot of tariffs so that he can make more money, right? So what does this then show you? That USA still doesn't have money to actually do this reparation. But no, they claim that, you know what, we are saying that reparation look like handouts and whatsoever. They claim that, oh, you know what, reparations are like economic uplifting. We want to know what type of economic uplifting we're talking about. If it's not giving them cash handouts, what are they giving them? What are they like? What kind of uplifting economically are they giving to them to like necessarily maintain their status? And like, you know what, we are now economically uplifted if it is not for the money. Two, on the whole idea, we tell you that reparation still, like financial reparation, still changes nothing. Firstly, on the whole idea of
short-term solutions and long-term problems, as my first speaker and second speaker tells you. We tell you that, you know what, when you reparate these people, you're just giving them money just for them. What happens is that they still don't have anything. They still can't go to school. They still won't get the land they're talking about. So necessarily, you are just giving them long-term problems and something like that. We tell you that it's still ineffective, right, without structural reforms. Because we tell you that the structural reforms are currently in status quo, where people are being taught about the indigenous communities and something like that. They don't tell us how that is not like how that's not reparating them, but they just say, oh, you know what, oh no, that doesn't exist or something whatsoever. And we tell you there is still no empowerment through handouts. If you say that the people are you know what, they are disenfranchised and whatsoever, so they need empowerment, they need self-actualization, right? There is no empowerment through handouts. How am I going to be empowered to get back what I lost, or to get the feeling that, you know what, oh, like I was oppressed through just a handout? Now on to like things like clash points. Firstly, on the whole idea of practicability of the implementation of the reparation. Firstly, we tell you that firstly, who is getting these reparations? Two, how much and how many people? Who is determining who is eligible and how much are they eligible to get? Something, even though that, like, they may come and say we are claiming it to be a policy motion, that's why you're telling, like, first of all, like, we don't know who's eligible to get this, right? We don't know, because there are things like crossbreeds, there are things and they tell us that like there are things like crossbreeds and whatever. Their main rebuttal to that is like, you know what, there are very huge budgets. Like, you know what, these countries have very huge budgets. Like USA, it spends a lot on US space exploration and things like military. It still doesn't change anything, right? Because like we see that a country like USA is still having the worst trade tariffs, like the worst economic downfall it has ever had. At that point in time, it still can't necessitate anyone, right? Two, on the whole idea of responsibility and morality. But on our side, we think that responsibility and morality should be viewed as an evolving concept, as my first speaker told you. But the governments today are different from the governments that in the past that put this, the colonial governments they are talking about, right? And their responsibilities have changed accordingly, like have evolved differently. It's more practical and more better to focus on current responsibilities that the government necessarily have in improving on the future of its particular country, rather than attempting to rectify historical justices through reparations that they can't even manage in the first place, and secondly, through reparations that are unjustified. So thirdly, on the whole idea of societal inequality, but we tell you that, oh, people in a country like New Zealand, oh, you know what, people are going to, like, we are going to reparate these particular people who have been indigenous. Oh, that is well, we are going to give them economic uplifting. All right, so the people who are not indigenous, right? So what is going to happen to them? Oh, you know what? They are just going to be there because, you know what, for them they are rich. They assume that they are rich and something like that. Oh, another claim we get from Team Affirmative is that, oh, you know what? The indigenous people don't like the people in those countries. They hate them. Oh, you know what? They despise them. When they look at them, they feel like something they try to push so that they can drive that, you know what, the disenfranchisement has not been working on whatsoever. But we tell you that, you know what, these people are living harmoniously in their community, right? We are not seeing civil wars breaking out in New Zealand between the indigenous people and the people who are currently settling there, or just because, oh my God, we're disenfranchised. There is a reason you are not seeing that. That necessarily means there is peace and harmony in those particular countries. What that then means to be is that instead of bringing more peace and more injustice, right, by favoring one community over the other, right, it still doesn't make it. Secondly, as I conclude, panel, right, you see, we acknowledge the profound injustices endured by indigenous communities, but we firmly oppose this motion on the grounds that it is neither practical or the most effective means to address these historical wrongs. As they say, reparations, as proposed, risk creating economic burdens, social divisions, and logistical complications that could ultimately undermine the very communities they aim to help. Instead, we advocate for status quo and what has been happening, like the empowering of indigenous communities, education, healthcare, land rights, and self-determination. We focus on building a future where equity and opportunity are the cornerstones of our collective progress, like what is there in status quo, rather than becoming mired in the complexities of a retrospective compensation. By rejecting this motion, we do not deny the past, but we commit ourselves to creating a sustainable, forward-looking solutions for the indigenous community as what is there in status quo. Thank you.
And also just to thank and excuse third opposition for submission. That brings us to the end of the substantive part of this debate. Calling on opposition reply. Here. Your speech ought to be 4 minutes.
Okay, panel, could you just confirm if you can hear me?
Loud and clear.
Okay. Sorry. I'll begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. I'm going to talk about how the debate went down and why exactly it's an upwin. I think I want to first talk about that impracticability chart, and later I'll say I'll show you why even if you remove that entire chart on the justifiable aspect or like the obligation part, it's still an upwin. I think firstly on the impracticability chart, I think the biggest problem with OP is that they came and painted a bad picture of these marginalized individuals. This looks like second speaker coming and telling us they're down bad, third speaker coming and telling us that look, they need the bare minimum, it's not a strain to government. I think that was wrong. I think the analysis which we gave you from OP was more plausible because we gave you examples. We told you you have black presidents in power, you have white people campaigning for power, you have tribal minorities getting into parliament, which means that the status quo isn't so bad. You have individuals who are actively getting better. Status quo isn't a bad thing. I think if they want to argue for bare minimum, our side already takes that win. But even lastly, on the ability of the governments to cater for these things, I think we showed you how it was a slippery slope in terms of like how you can't quantify these things. You can't quantify like rights, lives, genocides, which means that one, it's still a government strain, even if it's bare minimum. But even lastly, individuals are still going to retaliate. And I think this opens up to like the extension which was brought in second speech. I think this extension was important because it attacked the ability of them to achieve reparations on their side of the house. It was directly linked to the principle because we told you once you create social divide, you limit the ability of those individuals to become successful because individuals still don't like them because the government is then favoring them. I think the biggest burden which we gave prop was to defend radical changes in terms of land relocation or like massive financial compensation. I don't think they defended those things well. They can't win the chat. I think on that metric, we would take the debate. But even if we remove that metric, and this is the second part, I think on the justification part, I think the main push from government was that, look, there were two things. One, there was genocides and things which happened in the past, which means that governments now have to pay. I think the response from OP was that, look, no, governments today didn't contribute to those things, which means that you can't provide like a linkage between like colonial governments and governments of today. I don't think there's like a proper response to that. I think a second chat on things like responsibility was them coming and telling us that, look, our government got rich off these individuals, which means there's an obligation. I think the principle which we gave you in first and second speech was that, look, government obligation means that those individuals who, let's say, the government got rid of are actively benefiting from the government. I think we told you that the government caters for those individuals because government like obligation exists to like the state as a whole. On top of that, the analysis of like how government is actively doing these things means that those individuals still benefit from like the government, even if they stole it from them, they're still getting their price back. We think that obligation does not exist. I think the biggest comparative here was that which side affects the people as a whole. I think our side takes that because we showed you status quo mechanism isn't bare minimum, as Prop said. We recharacterized that, which was uncontested. Status quo mechanism looks like these individuals have seats in power, have seats in Congress. I don't really think we got enough engagement on the majority of the status quo mechanisms which we brought on our side. I think we engaged properly, and the chat was on their mechanisms were cultural preservation, which was in status quo. But even if it wasn't, they don't give us analysis as to why, like extra cultural preservation or how it looks like on their chat. But even secondly, on financial compensation, I think we engaged on their only two mechanisms. Even if their third speaker comes and contradicts them and says, no, it's not cash, it's actually compensation, I don't think they paint how that looks like or why it's able to achieve like any form of reparation. I think we engaged on their metrics. They don't engage in so many things we brought about. I think on our side, we better that. I think lastly, like why exactly our side takes the debate is because we care about the individuals more. I think they try to dismiss our main impacts and talk about like, hey, it's not about like other people, it's majorly about these individuals. I think they missed the link that showed you if you affect individuals, you all actively affect those marginalized people too, because they are part of the community, they are part of the country. If the country strains, they suffer. If the country strains, people blame them, which means they themselves are also affected. I don't think there is too much of our material. I think on the contesting principles were weighed on, and we showed you why our principle is more important. We don't get a response from that. Vote opposition. Yeah. Thank you.
House wishes to thank and excuse opposition reply for that submission, calling on Gov reply to conclude the matter on the floor at large. Here.
Okay, I'll be starting my reply in 3, 2, 1. Chair, I think the notion that reparation is recruitable for your destruction is something that we inherently have to take in for this particular kind of debate to inherently like flow even in the first place, right? So firstly, I'm going to show you on a comparative level as to why we inherently win this particular debate in my reply. Two things, I think on the moral and ethical imperative, we are able to highlight for you the need to go ahead and address things like historical injustices and provide redress even in the first place, right? At a point where we talk about things like preservation of culture in our mechanism, we think that is something that is sort of like very important because we already show you the importance of preserving this particular kind of cultures even in the first place. But even B, things like economic empowerment, right? The chart we necessarily get from opposition are things like empowering these particular communities and providing education. We think this has already existed, this has already worked, and at that point in time, we don't think that we necessarily get pragmatic even after we provide these things for these marginalized communities, right? We think at a point where our proposition one goes ahead to empower these particular indigenous communities economically and provide things like self-sufficiency. We think that is something should be considered, and that is why we win on that particular kind of comparative, right? We think that OPS attempt to go ahead and dismiss things like the moral and legal imperative for reparations to these communities is something that is intuitively sort of like unconvincing, right? So we think at a point where we recognize that historical justices go ahead to demand accountability and redress in the first place. We think that is like sort of very important. Within the dynamics, we think that reparation and reconciliation are things that go hand in hand. At the point where they give you cases like for Kenya, even in the first place, we think that is something that is not justifiable and sort of like irrelevant, even in the first place in the vast majority of instances, right? We think the bulk that we still get from opposition is basically about the chart that there's much more likely going to be like some sort of a potential load the government is going to face, right? What we tell you is that this whole idea ignores the significant economic benefits that these particular communities are much more likely going to bring like on table if their rights and interests are like sort of recognized and respected even in the first place. But the other chart they tell you about things empowering communities and education, this has already existed. This has not inherently helped. While the reason as to why we think a reparation becomes something that is sort of like justifiable is something you get from entirely our speeches even in today's debate, right? So firstly, on the other hand, what opposition fails to inherently show you is like sort of like a justified principle as to what would have like sort of happened if this particular government had like provided this particular kind of reparation to these indigenous communities in the past. The question is, would this particular kind of whole idea like sort of prevented like some sort of ongoing disparities that were already faced by these communities? Luck to show you that kind of particular justification, we think they still lose out on those particular things because inherently sort of like that structure like had certain missing links even in the first place, right? At the point where they not even justify why these particular historical injustices afflicted upon these particular communities become like something very detrimental, something that need a particular cause, something that is like sort of like very urgent, and things like empowering communities and providing education are not like sort of going to like solve it. They do not show us, and therefore whatever kind argument they present do not like achieve any sort of solvency in the first place. The reason why we're able to win is because on the principle of moral responsibility, we are able to show you why it is like sort of morally important for people who have for far too long been sort of like disenfranchised, need this kind of reparation, and things like empowering communities are not going to work out even in the first place. What they failed to show you and prove to you is at a point in time where these governments, the shortly said, whereby there is true that inherently like sort of try to go ahead and apprehend or probably like pay back this kind of compensation in the first place when they provide things like empowering communities and things like education in the first place, that is still like sort of not justified. With that, I'll have to rest.
House wishes to thank and excuse affirmative reply. That brings us to the end of what was a heated, interesting debate. My panelists and I will spend about 10 to 15 minutes in the deliberation room. Kindly do not leave the room. The round is open, so we will come back and we'll give you OA and the call. All the best. Okay, I hope I'm audible and that this tone of voice is okay for everyone.
Yes, you are audible.
Okay. So this is how I'll structure my OA. First, I'll start with general feedback. Then we'll go to, So I'll start with general feedback, then the average intelligent voter perspective on this motion, and then what the debate should and should not have been, then the call and justification for said call. I hope that's clear, right? Cool. I think general feedback would be three things. One, reply speeches are not rebuttals. You ought to understand that the reply speech is a comparative speech. At the point in time you want to continue taking jabs at each other and saying, oh, Prop didn't do this, Opt didn't do this, should have done this. It becomes one, it's very uncharitable, but B, it's very inconsistent, right? So reply speeches ought to give me clarity on what exactly happened, and then comparatively you're weighing metrics as to why you win. You don't just tell me you win because we responded by saying ABC. You win by giving me the metrics of comparative that would then owe to your success of your case. I hope that's clear, right? Secondly, and more importantly, if things are symmetric, kindly weigh. It's not very strategic to just say, oh, the stuff is symmetric on their side, so panel, you ought not to buy it. At the point in time, that is a concession you all make and say things are essentially symmetric, then you ought to weigh. Give me the comparative on essentially why exactly, regardless of these things being symmetric, then, one side is better than the other, again, for certain metrics, right? Thirdly, and this is now just addressed to third speakers, statistics are inefficient in as far as they don't, tie into the case that you're making, right? It's all fun and games if you tell me 73% of the US, they registered, they didn't vote. 97% of Indians registered and voted. That's great, right? But notice, it's very difficult for a panel to contrast and contest, statistics, right? As judges, we're average intelligent voters. What that then means is at the point in time, you do not relate the statistics you give to the argumentation that you make. We normally then just find it as argumentation in isolation, and by that metric, it becomes very, very difficult to credit. So I think just those three on general feedback, right? The average intelligent voter perspective on this motion, two very fundamental things. A, at the point in time you're dealing with countries like Canada, the United States, New Zealand, these are relatively developed nations. What that then means is that there's a particular access to structures that exist in the vast majority of cases, right? So I think it's very uncharitable to your case to start saying that, oh, people cannot access, we need healthcare, we need all these things, right? And I'll touch on that in my justification for why the win went the way it did. But secondly, it's also very fundamentally important to be well informed. I'm not saying, or you can have spec knowledge, that's a very good thing, but you ought to have a certain level of information that then informs how you then attach value or attach certain metrics to your cases. At the point in time, majority of your arguments are assertions. You say, we are going to do this, we think this, if this happens, we think this. That's uncomparative and not sufficient enough to then offer you a set of solvency on how you then rank over the other team. And that's why I think even the margin of this debate was very, very small, right? And then finally, what it should and should not have been. This debate should not have been about whether or not people can do these things, right? And I'll get into that even in my dissenting views. Notice, you can't, it's very uncharitable to argue feasibility and say, oh, the only reason we are not doing this is because we think we can't, right? At the point in time you're debating a motion, you ought to operate in the world in which it can work. The conversation then becomes, what happens at the point in time this is done? I hope that's clear. Cool. So after careful deliberation on a unanimous call, we have team proposition, WMMC in first. We have spicy mosquitoes in opposition as second. I'll say that again. We have team proposition in first. We have opposition in second. The call was unanimous. Cool. Couple of metrics we used to weigh this debate, right? I'll start with the dissenting views, working downwards, right? The debate reached a deadlock at the point in time. There was the argumentation on practicality that came from government, that came from opposition. Opposition say that, look, the complexities of this legal, rhetorics, it's very impractical to actively want to do these things, right? So there's no buy-in. You don't want to do these things because you have other things you essentially want to focus on. And by that metric, it's impractical. We buy into that argumentation of saying that it's complex to do these things. But after discussion, we find it's a very soft stance. At the point in time, you say the only justification for removing obligations from these governments is to say that, oh, you can't do these things, right? We think that soft stance was a bit problematic, right? Because even at the point in time where that practicality is something that still operates within status quo, why is it likely then that governments ought not, consider this as a factorial when it comes to offering reparations to these people, right? Proposition tell you the conversation is not that they cannot do these things. The conversation is they just do not want to do these things because they actively benefit from the disenfranchisement of these people. So all the argumentation that we get from OP in terms of saying, oh, you're going to have a cycle of dependency, it becomes very unclear to us the validity of having to run away from this responsibility and avert responsibility. Second argumentation was in terms of feasibility, right? At the end of the day, the panel thought it's uncharitable to argue feasibility because you can do these things. The conversation then becomes, should they have an obligation to do these things? Should they have a legal and moral obligation to reparate the disenfranchised communities? Cool. And three major metrics that all these wins then went to prop, right? A, on the responsibility of the government towards the indigenous group and who better caters to that responsibility. Notice, what we get from OP is to say that, past crimes ought not be blamed because, it's important to look at the future, right? And then essentially throughout your speeches, you talk about how there's an incentive to actively focus on other stuff and that sort of thing, right? Notice. And I think a lot of clarity in this round came from third prop, right? Third prop says that A, you are directly benefiting from this disenfranchisement. Even if these crimes are past, we still think the harms that trickle down still exist in the present in terms of tourism actively benefiting from visiting these disenfranchised groups, things like slum tourism, that sort of chat, right? But then secondly, and more importantly, the government has demonstrated they don't want to actively help these people, right? And at the end of the day, the conversation on vulnerability then becomes somebody was essentially harmed, whether it was 10 years ago or whether it was today, somebody has been harmed, people are continuously being harmed and that sort of thing, right? So the conversation, the deadlock then becomes, at the point in time, they do have this responsibility. Do they have the legal and moral obligation to to act on that responsibility to be able to reparate these people, right? Notice then. Second piece of argumentation that we credit from OP is the whole thing on we are focusing on other stuff. The government is essentially strained and that sort of thing, right? Proposition do an insufficient job to explain to us why then you're likely to deviate from the focus on these other stuff and why it is that you attach value to these indigenous people. Notice the conversation then, or the deadlock and the weighing metric then became at the point in time where it is the government obligation to, like, government has been given this, like, through the social contract theory and that sort of chart, you ought to then include everyone. At the point in time that is a concession, the minorities are included in that everyone. Then at what point do you then remove or absolve the whole aspect of responsibility of the government towards these indigenous groups? And then now how do you tie that to the moral and legal obligation to actively respond to these people? So on that clash, we had a proposition win on two metrics. A, they do a better job of sufficing the inefficiency of this, like the inefficiency of the capacity of these people to actually do these things. But then secondly, just on like a response factor and what happens if at the point in time you probably buy into oppositions, alternatives of saying that, oh, we're giving culture, oh, we're educating people and that sort of thing. At the point in time, there's not enough legwork from opposition and, from first up downwards to prove the sufficiency and the effectiveness of those alternatives to offer a sense of relief and solvency to the indigenous groups who are being disenfranchised. It becomes unclear to us then as a panel why they win on that metric. Secondly, the capacity of the government and how that then translates to the premise of legal and moral obligation. We get from up a couple of things. One, the government essentially has like other things to do, and at the point in time they invest and actively want to help these people, essentially you drain them and it's very constrictive, right? Opposition win up to the point where they talk to us about the fact that these are countries with large indigenous populations. So by extension, you actively, ought to consider the fact that A, there are many, B, there are many and disenfranchised, and that sort of chart, it becomes impractical. I think I've already touched on where exactly it is that practicality aspect is a very soft stance, right? Which is, invalid at a point, which is not like insufficient to then warrant them the win, right? But then prop then come and tell you that A, you have a capacity to redirect, right? There's a concession that's made on prop to say that government essentially is doing the bare minimum, right? And because they're doing the bare minimum, they essentially still disenfranchise these people. What opposition then had a burden to do on capacity is to prove the sufficiency of that bare minimum in materializing benefits for the indigenous people, right? At the point in time, there's a lack of clarity on how then you offer sufficient solvency, because there's a concession that said, oh, you can help these people. The capacity to which you can help these people is something that was, a bit of a contention. But again, we also argue feasibility is not something you can't run in this debate, but both teams brought it up anyway. So we had to clash and weigh that irregardless, right? But then thirdly, just on last metric, is the whole idea on solvency and access for these indigenous people, right? Opposition then come and tell us that essentially the alternative is much better. Essentially, you have seats in Congress, you have education, you have historical sites, and you have compensation, that sort of thing. That becomes valid, right? Proposition then called to question the effectiveness of all these things, right? Third prop tells you that all these things are invalid at the point in time you don't offer a capacity to be able to, enjoy this access, right? So it looks like if these people are not registered these people are essentially like not registered to vote and that sort of thing, then what's to say that the seats in Congress are sufficient enough to offer them that sort of representation, right? They then say that access is only as good as by the most proximate thing is like the goodwill of the government to actually materialize this thing for access, right? Opposition do not prove to us, or they prove to us very marginally, how essentially you get that access, you get that access, and that access is sufficient enough for these indigenous people, right? So again, on that third clash, we had a proposition over opposition, two very fundamental metrics. A, they are able to prove to us the incapacity of access and how that then becomes premise for the government to be morally and legally obligated to reparate these people and offer them a sense of agency in status quo. But even secondly, in terms of like the focal point, right? What we get from opposition is to say that all disenfranchised people are like all the people in the indigenous population are essentially disenfranchised. Prop then give us some clarity and say that, look, the conversation cannot be all the indigenous people. The conversation ought to be the people who are disenfranchised, right? So it kind of locks out a whole argumentation on saying, oh, the Chinese, oh, the Indian, them being in them like being indigenous and that sort of chat. Yeah, so Gav win on that metric on one, the extent to which people are disenfranchised, right? And how then that translates to the obligation. But secondly, the focal point and what ought to be considered at the point in time, these are decisions you are actively making. Questions, comments, concerns, complaints?
I just wanted to know what team proposition should generally improve.
Okay. In summary, I would say that the assertions are a big issue, right? At the point in time, I'll start with first prop. At the point in time, you're making assertions and you're saying that people will be able to receive these things. You will get these things. The question is, how do you get these things? Why is it likely that you're going to materialize these things? Why is it sufficient? So usually when you're prepping, and this now goes to like both teams, right? You ought to, be comparative, be very, very explicit with what you say. How do things work? Why are things going to happen? How effective are those things going to be? How, the extent to which people benefit, the magnitude to which people are affected. It's not sufficient to just say that, oh, people will receive. Yeah, people are able to receive. Prove to me the extent to that capacity. I think that's how you then edge in terms of your speeches, in terms of coherency. It makes it very easy for the judge to track. But even secondly, it makes it very easy to identify like loopholes. So if you miss anything, you can then inform your second speaker or your third speaker, hey, I missed out on ABC, which could like ruin our case and that sort of thing. Or opposition could respond to how do we respond to this? We can respond to it on extent, on magnitude, on capacity, and that sort of thing. Yeah. Any other questions? Anything that might... Pardon?
Could also ask for feedback, like personal and terms like team for improvement.
Team opposition, you have my number. I'm wondering why, but it's fine. Cool. I think just simply would be very intentional with the comparatives that you make, right? And I think I'll address this specifically to, like, your whole case is hinged on the fact that government have other things to focus on, yada, 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 the alternatives are good. Again, prove to me the effectiveness. How effective is this thing to, even though I don't improve the lives of people? And this is where I tell like debaters to take a very hard line and say that, look, even if we don't improve the lives of people, at the point in time we don't make their lives worse, then that on marginal benefit is much better comparatively. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. So all the best in your subsequent rounds. Please move to the auditorium for further instructions.